She was the golden standard, Hollywood's most controlled, most perfect leading lady. But the camera never knew what the contracts demanded, what the palace required, or what she surrendered to become a fairy tale. Grace Kelly arrived in Hollywood as a finishing school graduate, with one thing the studios craved: an image so clean, so elegant, so untouchable that it could sell dreams. Within 5 years, she'd worked alongside the greatest directors of her era: Alfred Hitchcock, John Ford, Elia Kazan. She'd won an Oscar. She'd become the face of American glamour at the precise moment when America needed to believe in something pure. But every role she played was a negotiation with power. What to reveal, what to hide, who she could be off-screen, and who the world would allow her to become. By 1956, at the height of her influence, she walked away from it all to marry a prince she barely knew. The world called it a fairy tale. Grace knew better. The decision that defined a legend began long before the crown. Grace Patricia Kelly was born into old money, old names, and rigorous expectations. Her father, John Bracken Kelly, was a legendary Olympic rower, a self-made construction magnate, and a man who measured his children's worth by their discipline and achievement. Her mother, Margaret Major Kelly, came from a prominent Philadelphia family and carried the unspoken weight of propriety, the understanding that certain women, from certain families, were vessels for reputation, not expressions of desire. Grace was the youngest of 4 children, born in 1929 into a world where perfection was not an aspiration. It was an obligation. From childhood, she learned the art of the mask. She took ballet, ice skating, and drama lessons, not because she loved them, but because they were what girls of her standing did. She was told she was beautiful, but beauty without discipline was vanity. She was intelligent, but intelligence without restraint was dangerous. She learned to sit a certain way, to speak in carefully modulated tones, to smile without revealing too much, and to listen more than she spoke. Her siblings remembered her as serene, almost eerily composed, even as a teenager. What they didn't see was the fracture underneath. A girl who wanted to act, who felt drawn to the stage, but whose family regarded theatrical ambition as unseemly, as a step down from the respectable world they'd carefully constructed. Her mother particularly discouraged the idea. Acting was for girls without options. Girls like Grace had duties, not dreams. And yet something in her refused to be entirely contained. She attended Bennington College, where she studied drama almost in secret. She performed in small productions, felt the thrill of transformation, and tasted a version of herself that her family's world didn't permit. After college, she moved to New York and began auditioning for Broadway, telling her family she was pursuing modeling. The gap between what she said and what she did was the first of many silences that would define her life. Broadway led to television, and television led to Hollywood. In 1951, at age 22, Grace Kelly signed her first studio contract. The industry saw what she represented immediately: not sex appeal, not the sultry danger of a Vivian Leigh, or the wounded sensuality of an Ava Gardner, but something rarer and more marketable: aristocratic restraint. She was elegant without being aloof, desirable without being desperate. The studios, particularly MGM under Louis B. Mayer's tight control, understood that Grace Kelly could be the antidote to the post-war anxiety about women's independence. She was a woman who seemed content to be looked at, a woman who projected the illusion that fame and beauty didn't cost anything because she carried them so gracefully. The irony was perfect. They'd found the ideal vessel, and they intended to fill her completely. Within 2 years, she'd appeared in 14 films. She worked with Gary Cooper in High Noon, with Jimmy Stewart in Rear Window and Vertigo, with Cary Grant in To Catch a Thief. Alfred Hitchcock, in particular, became obsessed with her. He saw in her a quality he could exploit, a cool surface that suggested hidden depths, a woman who seemed untouchable, but could be made vulnerable, He cast her in 3 films, and in each one, he orchestrated scenarios where she was imperiled, manipulated, or forced to confront moral ambiguity. Off camera, Hitchcock's interest in her became uncomfortably personal. He made it clear that her continued casting depended partly on his favor, and he was not a man who separated professional admiration from personal desire. Grace navigated this with the same composure she brought to everything, never directly refusing him, never making a scene, but maintaining a distance so perfect that it became a form of rejection he couldn't openly acknowledge. This was the contract she'd entered: to be admired without being touched, to be desired without being asked, to exchange her privacy and autonomy for the privilege of being looked at on a screen. The studio system in the early 1950s was, in many ways, a gilded cage designed specifically for women like Grace. MGM owned her image, controlled her schedule, and dictated her public relationships. She was required to attend certain events, to be photographed with certain men, to maintain a reputation that was family-friendly, aspirational, and entirely divorced from her actual life. She wasn't permitted to date without approval. Photographers followed her constantly. Gossip columnists invented romances, spread rumors, and speculated about her virtue based on the length of her skirts and the company she kept. She had no legal recourse and no privacy. The contract she'd signed gave the studio rights to her likeness, her name, and her reputation. She was, in the truest sense, property. And yet, the more controlled her public life became, the more she seemed to thrive in her film roles. There was something about playing characters who were trapped, manipulated, or forced to choose between safety and authenticity that resonated deeply. Was she channeling her own constraints, or was she finding freedom in the one place the studio system allowed it, behind a character's name? In 1954, she won the Academy Award for Best Actress for her role in The Country Girl, a film in which she played a woman undone by her husband's addiction and her own buried resentments. She was 24 years old. At the ceremony, she was poised, humble, and visibly moved. The world watched and believed it was witnessing the triumph of a good girl, a woman of breeding and talent who'd earned her success through merit and virtue. What the world didn't see was the exhaustion underneath, the sense that she'd become a thing rather than a person, that every gesture was calculated, every smile was performance, and that the woman winning the Oscar barely existed anymore because she'd spent 4 years learning to disappear into other women's lives. By 1955, Grace Kelly was the most bankable female star in Hollywood. She had her pick of roles, her salary commanded respect, and her image was worth millions. She was also, by every account from those close to her, profoundly unhappy. She felt trapped by the very success that had made her untouchable. The studio system was beginning to crack. Television was rising. Younger actresses were arriving, and the old guard's grip was loosening. But Grace had already paid the price of her fame. She was 26 years old and had nothing left to prove to Hollywood. What she wanted, she later confessed to intimates, was to be left alone. She wanted a private life, a family, a world where she could exist without being constantly observed and judged. She wanted, in short, to disappear from the public eye entirely. Then came the call that would give her the escape hatch she'd been looking for, though it would cost her everything she'd built. In early 1955, the invitation arrived. MGM was arranging for Grace Kelly to attend the Cannes Film Festival to promote one of her films. It was a publicity junket, standard for major stars of her stature. What wasn't standard was that Prince Rainier III of Monaco, the 31-year-old ruler of a tiny Mediterranean principality, had requested to meet her. Rainier had seen her films and was intrigued. The palace wanted to arrange a photo opportunity, a formal meeting, nothing more. Grace, by her own later account, was reluctant. She was tired of being paraded, tired of her image being used as a tool. But MGM insisted. It was good publicity, they said. It would expand her European presence. And so, on May 6th, 1955, Grace Kelly walked into the prince's palace garden wearing a white ball gown, and something shifted. What happened in that garden, no one will ever fully know. The official story, the one released to the press, was a fairy tale. A prince and a princess meeting, by chance, falling instantly in love, and finding in each other a soulmate. The photographs told that story beautifully. Grace in white, serene and radiant. Rainier beside her, clearly enchanted. The world believed it because it wanted to believe it. It fit perfectly with the narrative that had been built around her. A good girl from a good family, rewarded with the ultimate prize, a real prince and a real crown. But the reality was more complicated. Rainier was lonely, trapped in a principality facing financial ruin, desperate to modernize Monaco's image and secure the line of succession. He needed a wife, and he needed her to be famous, glamorous, and acceptable to European nobility. Grace, for her part, was offered something that Hollywood could never give her, a legitimate reason to disappear. As a princess, she wouldn't be an actress anymore. She'd be something far more prestigious, and, crucially, something that would place her above the gossip and speculation that had haunted her for 5 years. She would be a wife, a royal, a woman with duties that superseded any studio contract. She would, at last, have a socially acceptable reason to stop performing. But was it love, or was it another contract? Grace herself seemed uncertain. In the months between meeting Rainier and agreeing to marry him, she continued her film work, signed a new contract, and tried to imagine a future. She was 26. He was 31. They had spent perhaps a handful of hours in each other's company. And yet, by December 1955, she had agreed to become the Princess of Monaco. The wedding was set for April 1956. The MGM publicity machine swung into action. Grace Kelly, the studio's greatest asset, would have one final role, the real-life princess. It would be the most watched wedding of the decade, and every image, every moment, every detail would be carefully orchestrated to present the perfect fairy tale to the world. The transition from Hollywood to Monaco was, in many ways, a violation that no one wanted to acknowledge. Grace had to renounce her American citizenship, abandon her acting career, and assume a role for which she had no training and no desire. She'd spent 5 years learning to perform for cameras. Now, she would have to perform every moment of her life. Only this time, there would be no director calling cut, no script to guide her, no end to the scene. The Monaco Palace was not MGM, but it operated with similar logic. Image was everything. Privacy was a luxury for ordinary people, and Grace's body and time belonged not to her, but to the state. The Monegasque people expected her to be flawless, dignified, eternally composed. The European press, which had been gentler with her in America, began questioning whether an actress, particularly one from Hollywood, was truly fit to be a princess. Some murmured that Rainier had made a mistake, that she was unsuitable, that the American cinema had corrupted her. The years that followed were a slow, quiet unraveling. Grace became known for her reserve, her distance, her seeming coldness. The European press, which had initially celebrated her as a romantic figure, began to turn. They said she was snobbish, that she had airs, that she didn't deserve her position. Rainier, meanwhile, was often absent, preoccupied with Monaco's modernization and his own affairs, both professional and personal. Marriage to him was not the partnership she'd hoped for. It was another performance, another role in which she was expected to be graceful, to bear children, to support her husband, and to never, ever break character. The woman who had once said she wanted nothing more than privacy found herself in a position where privacy was impossible. She was the Princess of Monaco, and the world would never let her forget it. She was watched constantly, judged relentlessly, and trapped by a crown she'd never asked to wear. The photograph that defined her later years wasn't from a red carpet or a film premiere. It was from a palace window, showing Grace looking out onto the Mediterranean, her expression composed but distant, as if she were looking for something just beyond the horizon. Perhaps the woman she might have been if she'd never left Philadelphia, or if she'd never gone to Hollywood, or if she'd simply said no to a prince in a garden in Cannes. Grace lived in Monaco for 26 years after her marriage, slowly suffocating under the weight of expectation. She raised her children, supported her husband's reign, and was credited with transforming Monaco's image from a sleepy playground for the rich into a modern, respectable principality. She was, by all accounts, a good mother and a dutiful wife. But she was also a woman who had given up her profession, her country, her independence, and ultimately, her sense of self. She tried to return to acting once in the early 1960s, when she appeared in a television special. But Rainier shut it down. A princess, he made clear, did not act in films or on television. Acting was beneath her station now. The one avenue of self-expression she'd clung to was closed forever. In her later years, she filled her time with charitable work, gardening, interior design, and raising awareness about the arts in Monaco. She was beloved by her people, revered internationally as an icon of grace and dignity, and profoundly, quietly unhappy. Friends who visited her in the palace reported that she spoke often of her film career, with a kind of wistful melancholy, as if it had been a dream she'd once had, but could never quite remember. She had sacrificed her art, her country, and her autonomy for a crown, only to discover that the crown was simply another cage, more beautiful and more secure than the last, but a cage nonetheless. On September 13, 1982, Grace Kelly was involved in a car accident on a winding road in Monaco. She was 52 years old. The details of the accident were never entirely clear. Some sources suggest she may have suffered a stroke before losing control of the vehicle. Others point to mechanical failure or driver error. What was clear was that she was alone in the car, on a private road, in a moment where no one was watching. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life being observed, controlled, and contained, the irony was devastating. She died 2 days later, never fully regaining consciousness. The world mourned the loss of Princess Grace, the fairy tale princess, the American actress who'd married a prince. But those who knew her best understood that she had been mourning the loss of herself for decades. The woman in the photographs had been so carefully constructed, so perfectly maintained, that by the time she died, almost no one remembered the girl who'd wanted to act, who'd dreamed of a life on stage, who'd imagined a world where she could be free. Grace Kelly's legacy is complicated by the very perfection that made her legendary. She was beautiful, talented, and accomplished. Yet her beauty and accomplishment came at a devastating personal cost. She was trapped first by the studio system and then by the palace, each institution demanding that she be beautiful, composed, and compliant, and each punishing her when she suggested that she might want something different. The tragedy of her life is not that she became a princess. It's that she had to become a princess in order to escape the cage she'd already entered, only to discover that the escape was another trap. She gave the world an ideal, the perfect woman, the perfect wife, the perfect princess, and that ideal consumed her entirely. She became a symbol, an image, a representation of everything a certain kind of woman was supposed to be, and in the process, she lost the ability to be anything else. The photographs from her life tell a story of increasing distance, increasing distance, increasing distance. Smile after smile, composed and beautiful and utterly alone.